My name is Jill Bearup, this is History of Fanfiction Part 3, and we've made it to the 20th century! Woo! In Part 1 we discussed the history of derivative works and participative storytelling from Homer to King Arthur, who, a viewer informs me, was not just a character in English and French poems and stories, but also has quite the history as a Welsh folk hero too. Arthur gets around. And we talked about how stories have been held in common rather than owned by their authors for most of history. In Part 2 we discussed the history of copyright, and how we went from everything being up for grabs, to no precise copies of other people's books but otherwise go wild, to the idea that authors own not just their characters and stories, but the right to restrict other people from using those characters in a way they didn't like. But we also said that the disapproval of authors has never stopped participatory storytelling before, and so to fanfiction, and the fanzine. If you want to talk about fanfiction, you need to talk about fanzines. Fanzines are fan-made, not-for-profit magazines in which people published essays, travelogues, art, and even occasionally fiction. There are examples of amateur not-for-profit magazines going back as far as the 19th century, but they became particularly popular in the 1930s with the sci-fi community and the formation of sci-fi APAs, that's amateur press associations. The first recorded use of the term fanfiction was in 1939 when it appeared in Le Zombie fanzine. And Milt must be congratulated on the story. It is definitely pro and not fan fiction. Later examples would be somewhat less pejorative in their use. In 1944's Fancyclopedia, fanfiction referred to fiction containing fans or pros, now referred to as RPF or real person fanfiction. The Fancyclopedia specifically stated that the term was sometimes improperly used to mean fan science fiction, that is, ordinary fantasy published in a fan magazine. But definitions march on, and so must we. Fanzines were a big part of fan culture for most of the 20th century, but if you want to talk about fanfiction specifically, and we do, we should jump to the 60s, the media fanzine, and Star Trek. Because if you want to talk fic, there's an important question that needs to be asked. Sci-fi fandom and fanzine publication was largely, though not exclusively, male for the first few decades of its life. It wasn't that there weren't any women writing or indeed reading speculative fiction, it's just they were pretty outnumbered by the dudes. Most of the sci-fi zines of the time were edited by men, and generally they didn't contain a lot of fanfiction. But a lot of media fanzines, that's zines based on TV shows like Star Trek or The Man from U.N.C.L.E., which started to gain popularity in the 60s and beyond, were edited and produced by women. Spockanalia, the first Star Trek only fanzine, had a letter to its editors in the third issue from Gene Roddenberry himself, which stated, "We have used all the extra copies to make sure that every new writer and anyone who makes decisions on show policy have read your fanzine, and St. Philae, another fanzine which was also edited by a woman. Star Trek needs fans like you." Media zines tended to be less about fans and fandom and more about the media proper. And so they contained less in the way of stuff about fans and more in the way of stories, fanfiction, and illustrations, fan art. Where my ladies at? They're writing fanfic. 83% of Star Trek fanfiction authors were female by 1970 and 90% by 1973. One of the exceptions to this gender ratio can be found in the Doctor Who fandom, where men tended to outnumber women about 3 to 1. And though Doctor Who fanzines very often published fanfic, including some by Peter Capaldi, who is now the 12th Doctor, not to mention publishing stuff from Stephen Moffat, the current showrunner, as well, there weren't so many women producing content in the Doctor Who fandom. Again, that's not to say that they didn't exist, just that they were somewhat outnumbered. Regardless, the publication and sharing of fanfic among like-minded people had taken off, and it was largely, though not exclusively, women driving both supply and demand. What kind of supply? What kind of demand? Oh, all sorts. Including the kind where Spock and Kirk get it on. The Captain Kirk Mr. Spock relationship is so old that its writers invented the term slash. Not that people hadn't been writing slash before, it's just now it had a name. Slash sounds quite violent to the uninitiated, but it basically means this dude is attracted to this other dude, maybe mutual. Depends. This was represented in summaries as K/S or Kirk/Spock, hence slash. The slash denoting romantic or sexual relationship as opposed to K and S, which would denote friendship. Fem slash being ladies with ladies and het being man-woman pairings. The first fanzines dedicated solely to fic about the Kirk-Spock relationship started to appear in the late 70s, though people had of course been writing fic about it for nigh on a decade at this point. But no matter how racy the content might get, Star Trek fanzines had very little trouble. Not just because Star Trek was off the air by the time slash zines got big, but also because Gene Roddenberry, as we have seen previously, was a big fan fan of fandom. In an intro to a book of Star Trek stories culled from fanzines, Roddenberry stated that Star Trek fan works of all kinds were the highest compliment and the greatest repayment that fans could ever give us. This opinion was not universally shared. Star Wars was a media game changer. When it was first released in 1977, it was a huge hit and quickly gained a massive following. And that following included quite a few Star Trek fans who were well versed in fanzine production. The first Star Wars fanzines appeared a month after Star Wars came out. A month. And while the fanzine The Force was all meta and art, Hyperspace did contain some fanfic. Here's part of a 1977 letter from George Lucas to the editors. Thank you for sending us a copy of the fanzine Hyperspace. Right now we're working out a policy about fanzines. Basically a problem with copyrights has to be resolved. Once that is accomplished, I'll be able to send a press kit with photos and articles and biographies. I hope that material will be of use. You may be thinking, if you're a fan in the modern day, that sending copies of your fanzine to the creators of the thing is deeply, deeply weird and uncomfortable to you. But you have to remember that media fandom was quite new at this point, and so there wasn't really an accepted way of doing things, and also possibly Gene Roddenberry had given people unrealistic expectations of the niceness that could be expected. The thing about Star Wars was that it was the first film that really became a franchise. Turns out that even if there's not much money in ticket sales, you can make bank with merchandise. Including, of course, the book spin-offs that would become part of the expanded universe. Does that sound like a nice way of saying legal fanfic that you can actually get paid for? Yeah, and maybe that was part of the reason that Lucasfilm had something of a change of heart about fanzines. Fast forward to 1981 and a number of zine publishers received a letter from Lucasfilm telling them that it will no longer be safe for publishers such as you to feel immune from enforcement action by Lucasfilm. That may also be due to two stories which made waves. The first being The True Force, which was published in a Swedish zine in which Darth Vader sexually tortures Han Solo. Yeah. And a Han Leia-fic called Slow Boat to Bespin, which Lucasfilm apparently considered X-rated. However, it should be noted that the publishers of Slow Boat to Bespin had sent a copy of it to Lucasfilm a year in advance to ask for their permission. Again, it was a different time. Anyway, the upshot of our Star Wars saga is that Lucasfilm banned pornographic fanworks. No X-rated stuff, you kids, PG only, because apparently we've never heard of the R rating. We're generally leery about fanzines and fandom as a whole, and generally contributed to a fandom where if you wanted to read slash or explicit fic, then you had to know a lady who knew a lady who could pass you a photocopy underneath a convention table. After all, Lucasfilm was making money just fine from their novels. You wouldn't want any of this free stuff over which they have no creative control to muddy the waters, now would you? Not to mention that because Star Wars was such a huge hit and because George Lucas was not Gene Roddenberry, Lucasfilm didn't really see a need to let its fans write fanfic to keep them happy. After all, they're going to be fans anyway, right? Here's a quote from Jim Ward, VP of Marketing at Lucasfilm in 2002. "We love our fans, we want them to have fun, but if in fact somebody is using our characters to create a story unto itself, that's not in the spirit of what we think fandom is about. Fandom is about celebrating the story the way it is." If relative newcomers to fandom wonder about the hide the fanfic from the powers that be attitude of some of the older folks, it's because of things like this. It took until the 90s for Slash to start appearing very gingerly in parts of the Star Wars fandom again. But you'll never stop the slashers. You'll just drive them underground. By the time The Phantom Menace came out in 2001 though, things were a bit different. Obi-Wan Qui-Gon took off like a homoeroticism-powered rocket, but at this point, what was Lucasfilm going to do? The world was a different place by then. Because, you know, internet. And so it is to the internet that we are headed in our next episode. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/JillBearup and throw me a couple of dollars a month. If not, you can donate via PayPal using the donate button below if you're on Storygami or Maven. You can follow me on Twitter @JillBearup, or you can just join me next time for a dive into the depths of the World Wide Web. And if you want to watch the earlier episodes in this series and you're on YouTube, you can click over here or there'll be links in the description.